Free trade is a policy followed by some international markets in which countries' governments do not restrict imports from, or exports to, other countries. Free trade is exemplified by the European Economic Area and the North American Free Trade Agreement, which have established open markets. Most nations are today members of the World Trade Organization multilateral trade agreements. However, most governments still impose some protectionist policies that are intended to support local employment, such as applying tariffs to imports or subsidies to exports. Governments may also restrict free trade to limit exports of natural resources. Other barriers that may hinder trade include import quotas, taxes, and non-tariff barriers, such as regulatory legislation. Features of free trade. Free trade policies generally promote the following features: trade of goods without taxes or other trade barriers, trade in services without taxes or other trade barriers, the absence of trade-distorting policies that give some firms, households, or factors of production an advantage over others. Unregulated access to markets. Unregulated access to market information. Inability of firms to distort markets through government-imposed monopoly or oligopoly power. Trade agreements which encourage free trade. Economics of free trade. Economic models. Two simple ways to understand the proposed benefits of free trade are through David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage and by analyzing the impact of a tariff or import quota. An economic analysis using the law of supply and demand and the economic effects of a tax can be used to show the theoretical benefits and disadvantages of free trade. Currently, the World Bank believes that, at most, rates of 20% can be allowed by developing nations, but Ha-Jun Chang believes higher levels may be justified because the productivity gap between developing and developed nations is much higher than the productivity gap which industrial countries faced. World. The tariff increases the domestic price to tariff. The higher price causes domestic production to increase from QS1 to QS2 and causes domestic consumption to decline from QC1 to QC2. This has three main effects on societal welfare. Consumers are made worse off because the consumer surplus becomes smaller. Producers are better off because the producer surplus is made larger. The government also has additional tax revenue. However, the loss to consumers is greater than the gains by producers and the government. The magnitude of this societal loss is shown by the two pink triangles. Removing the tariff and having free trade would be a net gain for society. An almost identical analysis of this tariff from the perspective of a net producing country yields parallel results. From that country's perspective, the tariff leaves producers worse off and consumers better off, but the net loss to producers is larger than the benefit to consumers can lead to trade diversion and a net economic loss. This is why many economists place such high importance on negotiations for global tariff reductions, such as the Doha Round. Opinion of economists. The literature analyzing the economics of free trade is extremely rich, with extensive work having been done on the theoretical and empirical effects. Though it creates winners and losers, the broad consensus among economists is that free trade is a large and unambiguous net gain for society. In a 2006 survey of American economists, 87.5% agree that the U.S. should eliminate remaining tariffs and other barriers to trade, and 90.1% disagree with the suggestion that the U.S. should restrict employers from outsourcing work to foreign countries, quoting Harvard economics professor N. Gregory Mankiw. Few propositions command as much consensus among professional economists as that open world trade increases economic growth and raises living standards. Nonetheless, quoting Professor Peter Soderbaum of Mälardalen University, Sweden, this neoclassical trade theory focuses on one dimension, i.e., the price at which a commodity can be delivered, and is extremely narrow in cutting off a large number of other considerations about impacts on employment in different parts of the world. About environmental impacts and on culture, most economists would agree that although increasing returns to scale might mean that certain industry could settle in a geographical area without any strong economic reason derived from comparative advantage, this is not a reason to argue against free trade, because the absolute level of output enjoyed by both winner and loser will increase, with the winner gaining more than the loser, but both gaining more than before in an absolute level. In the classic text, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, namely, in the passage of restraints upon the importation from foreign countries of such goods as can be produced at home, economist Adam Smith describes reasons for allowing free trade. History. Early era. The notion of a free trade system encompassing multiple sovereign states originated in a rudimentary form in 16th century imperial Spain. American jurist Arthur Nussbaum noted that Spanish theologian Francisco de Vitoria was the first to set forth the notions of freedom of commerce and freedom of the seas. Vitoria made the case under principles of jus gentium. However, it was two early British economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who later developed the idea of free trade into its modern and recognizable form. Economists who advocated free trade believed trade was the reason why certain civilizations prospered economically. Adam Smith, for example, pointed to increased trading as being the reason for the flourishing of not just Mediterranean cultures such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but also Bengal and China. The great prosperity of the Netherlands after throwing off Spanish imperial rule and pursuing a policy of free trade made the free trade, mercantilist, dispute the most important question in economics for centuries. Free trade policies have battled with mercantilist, protectionist, isolationist, communist, populist, and other policies over the centuries. Trade in colonial America was regulated by the British mercantile system through the Act of Trade and Navigation. Until the 1760s, few colonists openly advocated for free trade. In part because regulations were not strictly enforced, New England was famous for smuggling, but also because colonial merchants did not want to compete with foreign goods and shipping. According to historian Oliver Dickerson, a desire for free trade was not one of the causes of the American Revolution. The idea that the basic mercantile practices of the 18th century were wrong, wrote Dickerson, was not a part of the thinking of the revolutionary leaders. Free trade came to what would become the United States as a result of American Revolutionary War, when the British Parliament issued the Prohibitory Act, blockading colonial ports. The Continental Congress responded by effectively declaring economic independence, opening American ports to foreign trade on April 6, 1776. According to historian John W. Tyler, free trade had been forced on the Americans. Like it or not, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, advocated tariffs to help protect infant industries in his Report on Manufactures. For the most part, the Jeffersonians strongly opposed it. In the 19th century, statesmen such as Senator Henry Clay continued Hamilton's themes within the Whig Party under the name of American System. The opposition Democratic Party contested several elections throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s in part over the issue of the tariff and protection of industry. In Britain, free trade became a central principle practiced by the 1840s. Under the Treaty of Nanking, China opened 5 treaty ports to world trade in 1843. The first free trade agreement, the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, was put in place in 1860 between the United Kingdom and France, which led to successive agreements between other countries in Europe. In the U.S., the Democratic Party favored moderate tariffs used for government revenue only, while the Whigs favored higher protective tariffs to protect favored industries. The economist Henry Charles Carey became a leading proponent of the American system of economics. This mercantilist, American system was opposed by the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, James K. Polk, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. The fledgling Republican Party led by Abraham Lincoln, who called himself a Henry Clay tariff Whig, strongly opposed free trade and implemented a 44% tariff during the Civil War, in part to pay for railroad subsidies and for the war effort, and to protect favored industries. William McKinley stated the stance of the Republican Party as thus: under free trade the trader is the master and the producer the slave. Protection is but the law of nature, the law of self-preservation, of self-development, of securing the highest and best destiny of the race of man. It is said that protection is immoral. Why, if protection builds up and elevates 63 million, the U.S. population, of people, the influence of those 63 million of people elevates the rest of the world. We cannot take a step in the pathway of progress without benefiting mankind everywhere. Well, they say, buy where you can buy the cheapest. Of course, that applies to labor as to everything else. Let me give you a maxim that is 1,000 times better than that, and it is the protection maxim. Buy where you can pay the easiest, and that spot of earth is where labor wins its highest rewards. Many classical liberals, especially in 19th and early 20th century Britain and in the United States for much of the 20th century, believed that free trade promoted peace. Woodrow Wilson included free trade rhetoric in his 14 Points speech of 1918. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program, and that program, the only possible program, all we see it, is this. 3. The removal, so far as possible, of all economic barriers and the establishment of equality of trade conditions among all the nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. During the interwar period, economic protectionism took hold in the United States, particularly as a result of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which prolonged and spread the Great Depression. From 1934, trade liberalization began to take place through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. The British economist John Maynard Keynes grew up with a belief in free trade. This underpinned his criticism of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, for the damage it did to the interdependent European economy. After a brief flirtation with protectionism in the early 1930s, he came again to favor free trade so long as it was combined with internationally coordinated domestic economic policies to promote high levels of employment, and international economic institutions that meant that the interests of countries were not pitted against each other. In these circumstances, the wisdom of Adam Smith again applied, he said. In Kicking Away the Ladder, development economist Ha Junchang reviews the history of free trade policies and economic growth, and notes that many of the now industrialized countries had significant barriers to trade throughout their history. The United States and Britain, sometimes considered the homes of free trade policy, employed protectionism to varying degrees at all times. Britain abolished the Corn Laws, which restricted import of grain, in 1846 in response to domestic pressures, and it reduced protectionism for manufacturers in the mid-19th century, when its technological advantage was at its height. But tariffs on manufactured products had returned to 23% by 1950. The United States maintained weighted average tariffs on manufactured products of approximately 40 to 50% up until the 1950s, augmented by the natural protectionism of high transportation costs in the 19th century. The most consistent practitioners of free trade have been Switzerland, the Netherlands, and to a lesser degree Belgium. Chang describes the export-oriented industrialization policies of the four Asian tigers as far more sophisticated and fine-tuned than their historical equivalents. Some degree of protectionism is nevertheless the norm throughout the world. Most developed nations maintain controversial agricultural tariffs. From 1820 to 1980, the average tariffs on manufactures in 12 industrial countries range from 11 to 32%. In the developing world, average tariffs on manufactured goods are approximately 34%. Post-war since the end of World War II, in part due to industrial size and the onset of the Cold War. The United States has often been a proponent of reduced tariff barriers and free trade. The U.S. helped establish the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and later the World Trade Organization, although it had rejected an earlier version in the 1950s. Since the 1970s, U.S. governments have negotiated managed trade agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s. The Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement in 2006, and a number of bilateral agreements. In Europe, 6 countries formed the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which became the European Economic Community in 1958. 2 core objectives of the EEC were the development of a common market, subsequently renamed the Single Market, and a customs union between its member states. After expanding its membership, the EEC became the European Union in 1993. The European Union, now the world's largest single market, has concluded free trade agreements with many countries around the world. Current status: most countries in the world are members of the World Trade Organization, which limits in certain ways but does not eliminate tariffs and other trade barriers. Most countries are also members of regional free trade areas that lower trade barriers among participating countries. The EU and the US are negotiating a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, led by the US. 12 countries that have borders on the Pacific Ocean are currently in private negotiations around the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being touted by the negotiating countries as a free trade policy. Degree of free trade policies: the Enabling Trade Index measures the factors, policies and services that facilitate the trade in goods across borders and to destination. It is made up of 4 sub-indexes: market access, border administration, transport and communications infrastructure, and business environment. The top 20 countries and areas are: Singapore 6.1, Hong Kong 6.0, Netherlands 6.0, United Kingdom 6.0, Japan 5.9, Germany 5.9, Republic of Korea 5.8, United States 5.8, France 5.8, United Arab Emirates 5.8, Switzerland 5.7, Spain 5.6, Luxembourg 5.6, Finland 5.5, Taiwan 5.5, Denmark 5.5, Sweden 5.5, Belgium 5.4, Austria 5.3, Australia 5.2,